you even know how to make a pot of coffee, old man?" The voice, sharp and laced with an unearned arrogance, sliced through the low murmur of the top-secret briefing room. Lieutenant Commander Reynolds, a man whose crisp new uniform seemed to wear him rather than the other way around, smirked at his own question. He held his empty ceramic mug aloft as if it were a scepter, a clear and public demand for a refill. Alan McCarthy, 78 years old, did not turn immediately. His hands, steady despite the faint tremor of age, continued their methodical work of wiping down the stainless steel counter of the small kitchenette tucked into the corner of the secure facility. He moved with a quiet dignity, a man who had long ago made peace with the world and his place in it. He was just the civilian contractor who served the coffee, a ghost in the machine of national security. Reynolds exchanged an impatient glance with a younger lieutenant at his side, who offered a sycophantic chuckle. "Sir, I think his hearing aid might be on the fritz." The condescension dripped from every word. "Hey, Grandpa." Reynolds' voice boomed louder this time. "The mug, now." Alan finally turned, his calm, pale blue eyes meeting the officer's. There was no anger in his gaze, only a quiet, deep-seated stillness that seemed to absorb the hostility without reflection. He picked up the coffee pot, its dark, fragrant steam rising in the cool, climate-controlled air, and walked toward the briefing table. The briefing room was a state-of-the-art theater of modern warfare, a cavern of tiered seating and glowing monitors, all focused on a massive interactive map of the world. It was a place where decisions that shaped history were made, where men and women of immense intellect and authority debated strategies that would affect millions. Yet in this moment, all the focused energy of the room seemed to contract around the small, mundane drama unfolding at the coffee station. Lieutenant Commander Reynolds, a rising star in naval intelligence, was known for his sharp mind and an even sharper tongue. He was a man who had climbed the ranks quickly, mistaking his rapid ascent for inherent superiority. To him, Alan McCarthy was nothing more than a piece of the furniture, a relic from a bygone era, who was now employed to perform a menial task. As Alan approached, Reynolds leaned back in his chair, a deliberate gesture of dominance, and continued his performance for the junior officers who orbited him. "You know," he said, his voice carrying across the room, "I bet this is the most excitement you've had in years, huh? Getting to be in the same room as the real players." Alan said nothing. He simply reached for the mug, his worn, wrinkled hand steady as he poured the hot black coffee. The aroma filled the air, a starkly normal scent in a room dedicated to the abnormal. He didn't fill the mug to the brim, leaving just enough space for cream the way he knew every officer, including Reynolds, preferred it. It was a small detail, a sign of a meticulousness that went unnoticed and unappreciated. A few of the more senior officers in the room shifted uncomfortably. They had seen this before. Reynolds had a habit of puffing himself up by putting others down, and the elderly coffee attendant was his favorite target. It was a minor cruelty too insignificant to warrant a formal complaint, yet it soured the atmosphere of professionalism that the command prided itself on. They were here to discuss threats from foreign powers, to analyze satellite imagery and encrypted communications, but the most immediate threat in the room was the unchecked ego of one of its own. Alan placed the refilled mug on the polished mahogany table beside Reynolds's data slate. As he did, his sleeve hitched up ever so slightly, revealing a small, faded tattoo on the inside of his wrist. It was a simple design, a stylized bird with its wings swept back, barely visible against the weathered skin. Reynolds, in his arrogance, didn't notice. He was too busy soaking in what he perceived as the deference of the old man. He picked up the mug and took a noisy sip. "See? Not so hard, is it? Maybe there's hope for you yet." The junior officers tittered, and Reynolds' smirk widened. Alan simply gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod and turned to walk back to his station. The quiet dignity with which he absorbed the insult seemed to infuriate Reynolds more than any retort could. It was as if the lieutenant commander's barbs were simply sinking into an ocean of calm, disappearing without a ripple. He wanted a reaction, a flicker of fear or resentment, something to validate his own sense of power. Getting none, he decided to escalate. "Make sure you stick around after the briefing," Reynolds called out to Alan's retreating back. "The floor looks a little scuffed. I'm sure you know your way around a mop and bucket." This time the insult landed with a thud. The room fell silent. Even the junior officers looked down, a flicker of shame in their eyes. It was one thing to mock the man for being slow with the coffee. It was another to treat him like a janitor in a room full of commissioned officers. The line between a jab and outright humiliation had been crossed, as Reynolds's final cutting remark hung in the air. A senior officer seated at the far end of the main table, Chief Warrant Officer 5 David Briggs, felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Briggs was a man who had seen it all in his 35 years of service. He was a quiet professional, a man who understood the intricate machinery of the Navy not just from manuals but from decades of hands-on experience. He was an observer, a man who noticed the things that the ambitious, fast-moving officers like Reynolds often missed, and he had been noticing Alan McCarthy for months. He had seen the quiet efficiency, the way Alan anticipated needs before they were voiced, the almost invisible way he kept the lifeblood of the command coffee flowing without ever being a distraction. But he had also seen something else. He had seen the faint tattoo on Alan's wrist, the one that Reynolds had just overlooked, and unlike the lieutenant commander, Briggs knew exactly what it was. It was a symbol he had only seen in old classified files and heard about in hushed tones from a previous generation of warriors. The insult about the mop and bucket was the final straw. It was a profound violation of the unwritten code of respect that bound them all, from the highest admiral to the most junior sailor. While the other senior officers merely looked uncomfortable, Briggs felt a cold, hard anger crystallize within him. He knew he couldn't confront a lieutenant commander in the middle of a top-secret briefing. It would be a breach of protocol and would only make the situation worse, but he also knew he couldn't let it stand. With a quiet scrape of his chair, Briggs stood up. He caught the eye of the briefing commander and discreetly tapped his wrist, the universal sign for needing a short break. The commander, grateful for any interruption to the palpable tension, nodded his assent. Briggs walked out of the briefing room, his face a mask of calm determination. He didn't head for the restroom. Instead, he made his way to a small, soundproof communication booth at the end of the corridor. He closed the door, the click of the lock echoing the finality of his decision. He pulled out his secure phone and dialed a number that very few people had access to, a direct line to the personal aid of the highest-ranking officer on the entire base, Fleet Admiral Morrison. The phone on Commander Ethan Shaw's desk buzzed, a discreet but insistent vibration. As the aide-de-camp to Fleet Admiral Morrison, Shaw was the gatekeeper, the man who managed the unending flow of information and requests that came with commanding the entire Pacific Fleet. He glanced at the caller ID and his eyebrows rose slightly. Chief Warrant Officer 5 Briggs was not a man who made frivolous calls. Shaw answered on the first ring. "Briggs, what's going on? You're supposed to be in the intel brief." Briggs's voice was low and steady, but Shaw could detect an undercurrent of something he had never heard from the veteran officer before, controlled fury. "Commander, I apologize for the interruption, but we have a situation here." He proceeded to recount the scene in the briefing room, not with emotional language but with the cold, precise facts of a report. He described Lieutenant Commander Reynolds' escalating series of insults, culminating in the order to mop the floor. Shaw listened, his grip on the phone tightening. It was a disgusting display of arrogance, but still it seemed like an internal matter, something to be handled by the commander in charge of the briefing. "I understand, Chief," Shaw said, his voice level, "and I agree Reynolds has crossed a line. I'll make sure his commanding officer is made aware of his conduct." "With all due respect, sir," Briggs interjected, "I don't think you understand who he is talking to." There was a pause. "Who is the contractor, Briggs?" Shaw asked, his curiosity piqued. "His name is Alan McCarthy," Briggs said. The name meant nothing to Shaw. He had a dozen civilian contractors on his rosters. "Okay, sir," Briggs said, his voice dropping even lower. "Ask the Admiral what the call sign Ghost Owl means." Back in the briefing room, the tension remained thick and suffocating. Alan McCarthy had returned to his small kitchenette, his back to the room, and was quietly cleaning a coffee filter. He moved as if nothing had happened, his composure an unbreachable wall. This, more than anything, seemed to fuel Lieutenant Commander Reynolds' frustration. He had failed to get a rise out of the old man, and in front of his subordinates it felt like a defeat. Deprived of his target, Reynolds turned his attention back to the briefing, but his focus was gone. He felt the weight of the other officers' disapproval, and it pricked at his pride. He decided to double down, to reassert his authority through a final, undeniable act of dominance. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "On second thought," he announced, his voice ringing with false authority, "we can't have civilian personnel with this level of insubordination in a secure facility. I'm going to have security escort Mr. McCarthy out, and I'll be recommending a full review of his clearance and contract. We'll see how he feels about mopping floors when he's unemployed." It was a gross overreach of his authority. A lieutenant commander had no power to revoke security clearances or terminate civilian contracts. It was a hollow threat, born of a bruised ego, but in the charged atmosphere of the room it felt like a final public humiliation. Alan finally stopped his work and turned to face the room. For the first time, a flicker of something moved in his pale blue eyes. It wasn't fear, but a deep, profound weariness, the look of a man who had seen the very worst of human nature and was disappointed but not surprised to see it again in such a petty form. Just as Reynolds was about to press the intercom button to call for a security detail, the main doors to the briefing room swung open with a force that made everyone startle. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright light of the corridor, was Fleet Admiral Morrison. He was a tall, imposing man whose mere presence seemed to suck the air out of a room. His face, etched with the lines of a long and distinguished career, was set like granite. Beside him stood his aide, Commander Shaw, who held a data slate and wore an expression of grim purpose. The room, which had been uncomfortably silent, was now frozen in a state of collective shock. An unscheduled visit from the Fleet Admiral to a routine intelligence briefing was unheard of. It was like having a god descend from Olympus to watch a high school play. Every officer in the room, including the one leading the briefing, shot to their feet, their spines rigid, their hands snapping into sharp salutes. "As you were," the Admiral's voice boomed, a low baritone that needed no amplification. He didn't acknowledge the salutes. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, scanned the room, passing over the assembled officers as if they were invisible. He ignored the briefing commander. He ignored the senior staff, and his gaze swept right past Lieutenant Commander Reynolds without a flicker of recognition. His eyes landed on the old man standing by the coffee pots, the man in the simple civilian clothes who was now the sole focus of the most powerful man in the Pacific Fleet. The Admiral walked down the tiered steps, his polished shoes making no sound on the carpeted floor. He moved with a deliberate, unhurried pace, each step radiating an aura of absolute authority. The other officers remained ramrod straight, their eyes locked forward, a sea of uniformed statues. The Admiral stopped directly in front of Alan McCarthy, standing so close that he was almost toe-to-toe with the elderly contractor. The contrast was stark. The Admiral in his immaculate uniform, adorned with rows of ribbons and shining gold stars, and Alan in his simple, worn trousers and a plain red shirt. For a long moment the Admiral said nothing. He simply looked at Alan, his hard gaze softening slightly. Then, in a voice that was quiet yet carried to every corner of the silent room, he spoke a single phrase. "Good to see you, Ghost Owl." The name hung in the air, electric and incomprehensible to almost everyone present. Lieutenant Commander Reynolds' face went slack with confusion. He looked around, trying to understand what was happening. Ghost Owl? Was it some kind of code? A joke? But then he saw the look on the faces of the most senior officers in the room, the ones who had been in the Navy for decades. He saw the shock, the dawning realization, the sudden profound respect. Before anyone could process the words, Admiral Morrison, the 4-star commander of the entire Pacific Fleet, brought his hand up in a salute. It was not a casual gesture. It was a salute of profound respect, sharp, precise, and held with an unwavering intensity. He was saluting the coffee guy. The room didn't just freeze. It felt as if time itself had stopped. The only sound was the faint hum of the servers that powered the massive screens. The Admiral held his salute, his eyes locked on Alan's. Slowly, as if pulling a memory from a great depth, Alan McCarthy returned the salute. His form wasn't as crisp as the Admiral's, his arm slightly stooped with age, but it was correct in every detail, a gesture of shared experience and mutual respect that transcended rank and time. After a moment, the Admiral lowered his hand. He turned to face the stunned audience, his gaze sweeping over them before landing, with the force of a physical blow, on Lieutenant Commander Reynolds. "For the benefit of those of you who have not studied your own history," the Admiral began, his voice now cold and hard as steel, "let me tell you who you have been sharing this room with. This is Alan McCarthy." In 1968, then Ensign McCarthy was flying a reconnaissance mission over North Vietnam when his aircraft was hit by a surface-to-air missile. He and his co-pilot were forced to eject deep in enemy territory. The Admiral paused, letting the words sink in. For the next 72 hours, with a broken leg and no supplies, Ensign McCarthy evaded capture while carrying his severely wounded co-pilot on his back. He neutralized 2 enemy patrols, single-handedly silenced a machine gun nest, and called in an airstrike that saved an entire platoon of Green Berets who were about to be overrun. His call sign, the Admiral's eyes bored into Reynolds, was Ghost Owl. For his actions, he was awarded the Navy Cross. The Admiral turned his piercing gaze directly onto Lieutenant Commander Reynolds, whose face had drained of all color. He looked as if he might be physically ill. The smirk, the arrogance, the casual cruelty, all of it had evaporated, replaced by a stark, naked fear. "Lieutenant Commander," the Admiral's voice was dangerously quiet now, a predator's whisper. "You, who have never heard a shot fired in anger, felt it was your place to humiliate a man who has bled for the very flag on your shoulder. You dismissed him as a grandpa, as a janitor. You stand in a room dedicated to the gathering of intelligence. Yet you failed to see the most important piece of intelligence in this entire facility, the quiet hero standing right in front of you. The Admiral took a step closer to Reynolds, who seemed to shrink under the weight of his gaze. You are an embarrassment. You are an embarrassment to your uniform, to this command, and to the memory of every man and woman who ever served with honor. Commander Shaw, he barked without turning, relieve Mr. Reynolds of his duties. He is confined to his quarters pending a formal review of his conduct. I want him enrolled in a mandatory 1-month course on naval history and heritage, and then I want him assigned to the most remote, miserable outpost I can find, where he can spend the next year contemplating what it truly means to serve. Commander Shaw simply said, "Aye, Admiral," and made a note on his data slate. The career of Lieutenant Commander Reynolds was, for all intents and purposes, over. The Admiral then turned back to Alan, his expression softening once more. Alan had watched the entire exchange with his characteristic calm, a quiet observer to the storm he had inadvertently caused. He looked at the Admiral, and then at the now quaking Reynolds, and a flicker of something like pity crossed his face. He took a hesitant step forward. "Admiral," he said, his voice soft but clear. With all due respect to the young man, he just didn't know. The Admiral looked at Alan, a silent question in his eyes. Alan continued, his words addressed to the Admiral, but meant for everyone in the room. "Respect isn't something you command because of the rank on your collar. It's something you earn with your actions, and it's something you should give freely, especially when you don't know someone's story. Everyone is fighting a battle you know nothing about." As Alan spoke, the memory behind the faded tattoo on his wrist surfaced in his mind, as clear as if it were yesterday. He wasn't in the briefing room anymore. He was back in the dense, suffocating jungle, the air thick with the smell of mud and cordite. He was 19 years old, and he was crouched in a foxhole next to his co-pilot, a young man named Frank, who was pale and shivering, a piece of shrapnel buried deep in his side. They were surrounded, the enemy closing in. Frank, knowing he was a liability, had tried to order Alan to leave him behind. "Go," he had whispered, his voice weak. "That's an order." Alan had just looked at him, then ripped a piece of his own flight suit to fashion a tighter bandage. "We leave together," he had said, "or not at all." Just then a grenade landed in the foxhole. Without thinking, Alan threw himself on top of Frank, shielding him with his own body. The explosion was a deafening roar, a searing wave of heat and pain. When the ringing in his ears subsided, he realized he was alive. A small, sharp piece of the grenade had torn through his wrist, right where his co-pilot, an amateur artist, had drawn a small owl on his skin with a pen for good luck just hours before their flight. He had carried Frank for 3 days after that, the wound on his wrist a constant burning reminder of the promise he had made. The tattoo, which he had gotten years later, was a direct copy of that pen drawing, a permanent memorial to the man whose life he had saved, and the moment he had truly understood the meaning of sacrifice. The fallout from the incident was swift and decisive. Lieutenant Commander Reynolds was, as the Admiral had ordered, immediately relieved of his duties. He was escorted from the briefing room by security, his career in ruins. The next day, a command-wide memo was issued, mandating a new series of heritage and respect training modules for all personnel, with the first session to be taught by Chief Warrant Officer 5 Briggs. The story of what happened in the briefing room spread like wildfire through the base, becoming an instant legend. Alan McCarthy suddenly found himself the object of quiet reverence. Officers who had barely noticed him before now went out of their way to say hello, to pour their own coffee, to ask him about his day. They looked at him differently, seeing not just an old man but a living piece of their own history. Alan, for his part, changed nothing. He still arrived at 5 a.m. every morning, brewed the coffee with the same meticulous care, and kept his station immaculately clean. He deflected any attempts to talk about his past with a gentle smile and a change of subject. He had not sought the attention, and he did not revel in it. A few weeks later, Alan was leaving the base for the day when a young officer approached him in the parking lot. It was Reynolds. He was in his civilian clothes, and the arrogance he had once worn like a suit of armor was gone, replaced by a deep and genuine humility. He stood before Alan, his eyes downcast. "Mr. McCarthy," he began, his voice barely a whisper, "I don't have an excuse for how I treated you. It was arrogant, and it was cruel. I'm sorry. I'm truly sorry." Alan looked at the young man for a long moment, his pale blue eyes searching his face. Then he simply nodded. "I accept your apology, son." Reynolds looked up, surprised by the easy grace of the forgiveness. "That's it?" "That's it," Alan said. "You made a mistake. You're paying the price for it. Now it's time to learn from it and be a better man. That's all any of us can do." He offered a small smile. then turned and walked to his old modest car, leaving the former lieutenant commander standing in the parking lot, a man who had just received his most important lesson, not in a briefing room or a classroom, but from the quiet dignity of an unassuming hero. If you were moved by this story of quiet valor, please like and share this video, and don't forget to subscribe to Veteran Valor for more true stories of the heroes who walk among us.